It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker today. He's our partner. He's my good friend, United States Senator Rob Portman. I'm especially excited about today's program because it's focused on one of the toughest issues in Ohio and, in fact, in our community. It's one that we've talked a lot about on this stage, in this room, and all over Columbus, and that's our poverty rate in the many issues that come together to impact poverty. Senator Portman was elected in 2010 on a platform to bring jobs back to Ohio. We don't have to remember too far back then to realize the dynamics that were in our own community, the dynamics in Ohio and our country. Since then, he's worked hard in the Senate to reduce our deficit, on reforming our tax code, promoting pro-growth policies to help create jobs in our country in Ohio, and has done it very, very successfully. He's also spent much of his time in public service focused on and as a leader in drug prevention and helping communities work to combat drug abuse, addiction, and the associated lifting of our citizens out of poverty. I get the opportunity to work directly with Senator Portman and his team in Washington on economic development issues. In fact, after this meeting, I think he's with some of our team talking about important economic issues in our community. In all of our dealings, not only he as an individual, but all of his staff bring a very pragmatic approach to their work. Increasingly, he is a national leader, is recognized across our country as someone who brings a bipartisan approach and a constructive dialogue to the tough issues that are facing our country, which is candidly a refreshing and needed approach in Washington. And I might say, not because he's here in person, because I've said it a bunch of different times, I've had the opportunity to be around a lot of national leaders in my career. And there simply is nobody who has a more working knowledge, substance, intellect, and depth across a breadth of policy issues than Rob Portman. Just simply phenomenal that he serves our state in the style in which he does it and the team that he's put around him. He's focused on the issue of poverty for quite some time. He was the author of the Drug-Free Communities Act and the Second Chance Act, which together are addressing addiction and treatment for individuals who are involved in our criminal justice system. The Senator's been a strong partner here in Ohio, dealing firsthand with opiate abuse in that challenging issue. Most recently, he's urged our Attorney General, Eric Holder, to address prescription heroin head-on by drawing on many of the success stories, some of which are in Ohio and across the country, recognizing that we can't put our head in the sand on these very, very difficult issues. After the Senator is done with his prepared remarks, Colleen Marshall of NBC4 and the host of The Spectrum is going to join him on the podium for some Q&A between the two of them, and then open it up. Without further ado, you're here to hear an extremely important national leader, but our United States Senator and friend, United States Senator Rob Portman.
Alex, thank you very much. It's great to be here. I love this backdrop. I've never seen the athletic club look so good. And it's a very distinguished crowd here, and a lot of friends in the audience, some of whom I've known for a long time. Others of you I've worked with more recently on some of the issues that Alex talked about. And you know, I just want to start by saying the best export from Tennessee ever to Ohio was Alex Fisher. And the partnership does a terrific job. He's right, I'll be with the partnership later today, something they organized with Patel to talk about some of the big data advances here in Columbus, using data and analytics and creating jobs, and legislation that I got enacted recently that will help in that regard. But bottom line is the partnership's on top of it. And when they come to Washington, they come well organized. You know, we have fly-ins from every major city in Ohio, and even some smaller towns and communities. The partnership comes loaded for bear with very specific requests, and they're usually reasonable. Always good for Columbus, and we enjoy working with Alex because, to return the compliment, he is pragmatic. He gets stuff done, and I love working with him. A lot of good things going on in Columbus, and the partnership is one example of that. I saw Jane just briefly coming in. Thank you for inviting me here today and for letting me speak to this distinguished crowd, and making sure that the schedule worked for you all. There are a lot of folks here, again, who I hate to single out any one, but Colleen will hear from later. The last time she grilled me on TV, it was actually kind of fun because we talked about one of her favorite topics and my favorite topic, which is how do you get at this issue of human trafficking, and in particular sex trafficking. And she has been a terrific spokesperson for that issue and has helped to raise the awareness. A lot of this is just having the media talk about it and letting people know it exists. And then the answers tend to be found. When the community doesn't know about it, when it's in the shadows and happening, but not something that people are aware of, that's when it festers. And that's been one of the problems with sex trafficking and human trafficking generally in our state. Most of us, probably before getting into this issue, getting involved, think about it happening somewhere else. Like in Africa, as we've seen recently with these horrific examples of these young women being taken. But we have this situation here where girls in particular are held against their will in effect, and sex trafficking happens in all of our major cities and now in some of our rural areas. And so anyway, Colleen, you've been great on that. It's one of the issues that I won't get into detail on today, but it's one of the underlying causes of poverty, but also a symptom of poverty. I see Leonard Hubert is here. I didn't know Leonard was going to be here for sure, but he is chairman of the House Civil Rights Commission. More importantly, he's been helpful to me on a number of issues, including, Alex mentioned the Second Chance Act. Leonard and I met in prison. Seriously. It was just one day, luckily for me and for him, but it was 11 years ago, and it was at the Lebanon Correctional Institute. And at that time, he was working on Second Chance Act initiatives in Ohio, and we were trying to put together some federal legislation. Went to the Lebanon Correctional Institute to talk to them about some of the work they were doing on rehabilitation to try to get some of these people who were leaving prison, into more productive lives. And we ended up writing some legislation that's now being used aggressively here in Ohio and around the country, and I appreciate him being here. Marcy Seidel is here, and where are you, Marcy? There she is, hiding right next to Leonard. So Marcy is head of the group that coordinates all the community coalitions around the country, and Alex mentioned the Drug-Free Communities Act and the community coalitions. We'll talk about that in a minute more, but I appreciate Marcy and the Drug-Free Action Alliance. We were together at a town hall or a roundtable discussion, I don't know, about a month ago here in Columbus, and I appreciate what she does every day to try to encourage the prevention and education part of substance abuse. Alex mentioned that I'm basically an economic and fiscal wonk. I'm a policy nerd. My reputation is probably more in those areas. Budgets, everybody still awake. Taxes, the issues that have to do with economic growth. How do you deal with energy or healthcare or trade in a way that gets growth going? And those tend to be the committees I'm on and the jobs that I've had. Some of you I saw have this. I didn't know you were going to have it, but it's a jobs proposal, and I think it all makes sense. That's not what I'm going to talk about today. That's typically what I do focus on, but I've also focused ever since I got elected on this issue that really is an underlying problem in our society and has been forever and will be going forward. There are no easy answers. There's no magic solution, but it's this notion of persistent poverty and how do we address it and how do we pull people up and allow for the kind of upward mobility that this country is part of our promise to our citizens is that regardless of what your last name is, what zip code you grew up in, that you have a chance to make it in America. Too many see hopelessness and despair and don't see that opportunity, and that continues to be, even sometimes in good economic times, something that we just haven't been able to figure out in this country. We started a war on it 50 years ago. It was called the War on Poverty, and it was started with all good intentions by Lyndon Johnson, and we're today, this year, just about a month and a half ago, as I recall, celebrating that 50th anniversary of that war on poverty. And yet, it does persist. And the numbers are pretty sobering. Today, 47 million Americans are under the poverty line. And, arguably we're the richest country in the world still. and yet we have this persistent problem. It's probably worse than that, because probably among people who are at 50% of poverty or below, it's probably at the highest levels it's ever been since we started keeping track of these statistics, which goes back over 50 years. It's about 6.6% of us. And so, you know, yes, the economy's doing a little better. Here in Ohio, by the way, we're doing better than the national average now. Things are starting to pick up, as Alex said. But we have this persistent problem. It's not a matter of us not focusing on it enough from a taxpayer perspective in terms of federal funding, in the sense that over $15 trillion has been spent during that 50 years on programs that would be considered anti-poverty programs. So what is working, what is not working is something that I think we ought to spend a lot of time focused on. People think, well, Columbus is the city in Ohio that, as I said earlier, kind of has its act together economically, and we're growing, and everything's great in Columbus. After all, we have Ohio State, and we have Battelle, and so on. I see Ted, we have the Limited, we have a lot of great companies. Here in Franklin County, and this might surprise you, from 2001 to 2011, the child poverty rate rose from 15 to 26.5%. So think about that. Here in Columbus, more than 1 out of 4 kids live in poverty. And, you know, again, this is not an easy issue to deal with, because there are no easy answers. It requires, I think, a partnership at the federal, state, and local level that we're not doing yet, as we'll talk about. But this is insidious in the sense that it's generational, and it tends to be one where it's difficult to get out of it once you're in it. And eventually, as I said earlier, the hopelessness tends to take over. And when you lose hope and faith, it's even harder to get out of it. There's a statistic that I quote sometimes, and other people do, and it's a very interesting one. It says that if a kid finishes high school, gets a full-time job, and waits until he or she is married to have children, only 2% end up in poverty. So you finish high school, you get a full-time job, you wait until you're in your 20s and married to have children, or just married to have children, 2% end up in poverty. That's pretty impressive. So let's tell everybody you gotta go to school and all, and that's fine, and we do that. But that path to success is tough for a lot of young people. Who are those kids that don't finish high school? They don't get the job, don't have the skills, that do have kids in their teens before they're married? Overwhelmingly, they're kids who grow up in poverty. So all that statistic is sort of hopeful and interesting. Here's another statistic. Kids who grow up poor are 90% more likely than children who've never been in poverty to enter their 20s without completing high school. Kids who grow up in poverty are 4 times more likely to give birth outside of marriage during their teenage years. So it's true that there are some incredible examples and some shining examples, and there's some here in this room, of people who grew up in abject poverty and ended up being successful, productive citizens, able to take care of their families and be, taxpayers and make a big difference in their communities. But unfortunately, that's the exception. Poverty begets poverty. It runs in a cycle. And I believe it's going to take an aggressive approach, and I think it's kind of a two-pronged approach as I see it. One is to create that economic growth that this document you have before you talks about, and I think we aren't doing some of the basic things there. This speech is not about that. Again, don't get me started, but there are things that we can and should do at the federal level, at every level of government, to create the environment for more economic growth and success, and that's certainly a big part of it. But second, I do think that we have to look at the underlying causes of poverty more. Things like family breakdown, things like drug abuse and addiction, which we'll talk about in more detail, crime and the criminal justice system, how it works in our society to encourage this persistent poverty that we talked about. So again, the first thing is let's build an opportunity society, and we can and should. The income gap gets a lot of headlines. What concerns me more, and I think should concern us all more, is the lack of upward mobility. I think that it is what, again, is not just America's promise, but it's the way to help create this opportunity society we all hope for. I think we should be less concerned about bringing people down than we are about bringing people up. We should be concerned about how do you create the environment for success. Here's a statistic that does a pretty good job of illustrating this problem. Of those folks who were poor in 1980, that means bottom fifth when it comes to income, 21% had risen to the middle class by 1990, a decade later. So in 10 years, from 1980 to 1990, 21% had gone from being under the poverty line to being in the middle class. In 1995, if you look at that, those who were in the bottom fifth then, a decade later, they only had a 15% chance of reaching the middle class. So this is just between 1980 and 1995. In less than a single generation, we suffered a 1/3 decline in income mobility. So that, to me, is the biggest issue. If you look at it today, with more people dropping out of the workforce than any time since the Carter administration, I suspect it's worse. We've looked for the data more recently. We don't have it yet. But the next data point, of course, would be if you go from 1995 to 2005 and 2015, we look back, what will it look like? And unfortunately, I think it's going to look worse. We had the numbers come out today. Some of you saw it on job growth. There was job growth last month, which is good. What was bad is that there weren't enough jobs to be able to replace those who were leaving the workforce and just the normal growth in the economy, so the unemployment numbers didn't change. But second is the labor force participation number didn't change at all. And that's where people who are not working, not looking for work, meaning they aren't part of the unemployment numbers or even the long-term unemployed, which is also, by the way, at record levels for a non-recession. But these are folks who have dropped off the workforce altogether. That labor force participation rate is the worst it's been since the 1970s. For men, it's the worst it's been since the 1940s when we began keeping track of these statistics. What does that mean? Put it in these terms. Let's say unemployment, 6%, high fives in Ohio, 6.2% nationally, something like that. If you had the same labor force participation rate 5 years ago and today, unemployment would be over 10%. 5 years ago, 10.4%, go back 6 years, 10.8%. And that's what we're feeling, I think, in our communities, and that's probably what you're feeling when you talk to people and look around, is that the unemployment numbers are really higher than they appear. Why? Because people have simply given up looking for work. So that's the reality right now, and that's why I think if you look today, some of these upward mobility statistics would be even worse. We need to focus, therefore, on growth in the economy, and overall economic growth in the economy is important. Big, bold ideas. This is tax reform and regulatory relief, expanding exports, all the things, again, that are on that document. I think it requires structural reforms. I think our economic systems, we've just gotten accustomed to having this big economy here and big market here, and everything was going okay for us, and why change it? And we really haven't been aggressive about reform. And we need to get there. Other countries are. We're falling behind as a result, in my view. Education's a big part of this. And I'm not going to go into great detail here, although some of you have questions about it, but again, what the partnership is doing, what a lot of good groups, including elected officials, are doing here in Franklin County and in other major cities in Ohio, including in Cleveland, is exciting about education, because public education reform is an essential part of that economic growth equation. We've got to have the trained workforce. So is job training, by the way, at the federal level, which needs to be totally revamped also, which some of you have talked to me about, and I've got legislation on. The fact is, we don't have a 21st century workforce. We're not going to attract the economic growth that we should. Columbus is fortunate, again, to have the Ohio State and Battelle and other resources to be able to attract some of that talent. But that's one of those issues, along with trade and healthcare and energy and taxes and regulations. All that is needed. John F. Kennedy talked about this in his famous line where he says that a rising tide lifts all boats. And that's the rising tide, is you want to have better than the anemic 2% economic growth, actually minus 1% economic growth last quarter, but this year probably about 2% like last year. You've got to have better growth in order to create that environment to get people out of poverty and success. But I would argue that although a rising tide is necessary to address poverty, it is not sufficient, that a rising tide does not lift all boats. Because even with a rising tide, you're going to see some boats that end up stuck on the shoals, on the sandbars. And that's the problem, is that we've got to do a two-pronged approach. One is, yes, the growth is important. In fact, it's necessary. It's got to be part of it. But I think even if an economic boom started tomorrow, too many people would still be left behind from that rising tide. We've seen this in previous good economic times. We've had, economic growth of 4 or 5%. And still, again, this persistent poverty. The unemployment rate in the Columbus area is 5.9%, which is well below the national average, as we talked about. And yet the poverty rate in Franklin County is nearly 18%. So just an example, again, this community is doing well in many respects, and yet the poverty rate persistently high. So the root causes of systemic poverty, what are they? There are a lot. I mentioned family earlier, and family integration and being sure people have that support network. That's critical. But I do think this drug issue is one that is too often overlooked, and I do think it's one that if we don't address, it's going to be very tough to deal with this persistent poverty. Someone who's in the clutches of drug addiction, for that matter, someone who's been in and out of prison, doesn't have that family support system, someone who's dropped out of school and has no real skills, you can create all the jobs in the world, it's going to be impossible to help that person. So I think reducing poverty requires going beyond the talking points of the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, even some of the folks who are well-intentioned in the middle trying to figure this out and to say, you know, how do we get at some of these underlying causes? I do think the need to embrace new, innovative approaches to drug addiction, drug abuse is part of it, and an essential part of it. And let me take a few moments to talk about that. First, acknowledging that a drug addiction is not just about poor communities. It bedevils communities rich and poor, and having a big house in the suburbs and a nice car doesn't make you immune from drug abuse. And you probably see that among people you may know, or family, or friends. But I would say that it's also fair to say that it's particularly devastating to our poorest communities. Not just because of the addictions, but because of the consequences of the drug trade and what addiction does in those communities. People who don't have the skills or training, they need to get a good job, unemployment's high, whether it's poor Appalachian counties, say in southern Ohio, where the prescription drug abuse problem was at epidemic levels a few years ago. Now other opiates, including heroin, are taking their place. Or whether it's some of our poor urban neighborhoods that are now reeling from these heroin overdoses, the gangs, the violence, the crime that tends to build up around drug abuse, and the impact it's having in our communities. Every night in Ohio, somewhere in some city, somebody dies from a gun-related homicide, and it's typically related to gangs and crime. I just left some FOP officers of Fraternal Order Police who came to a veterans event we were doing, and you know what they tell me, law enforcement here in Columbus, is that's their single biggest issue, and it is related to drugs. So addiction and drug abuse and poverty go hand in hand. Unfortunately, the strategies we're using to fight addiction, in my view, are not succeeding. And I think our failures in the so-called war on drugs is undermining our fight against poverty. I do think law enforcement's important. I think drug interdiction's important. But as important as they are, I think we've got to acknowledge this is a disease, the disease of addiction that a war on drugs can never solve. I got involved in this issue primarily because right after I got elected to Congress, somebody came to me and said, what are you doing about it? I was a newly elected congressman, you know, involved in some of the issues that Alex talked about, more on the economic side as we talked about. This woman comes to me, and her son, Jeffrey Gardner, had just died from an overdose of huffing gasoline and smoking marijuana. How dumb can you get? But he did. He dropped over dead. And so she went around to the neighbors. She lived in a mobile home park in Claremont County, the next county over from Hamilton County where Cincinnati is, and no one would come to a meeting that she called. And she goes to her school, and they were in denial. We don't have a problem here. And if we do, it's not our problem. It's yours. And her church. And this has changed, but in the faith community, I see a lot more, not just acceptance of this and a change in terms of this denial, but embracing it and helping, and particularly on Second Chance and some other issues. But no one wanted to talk about it in her neighborhood. She came to me and said, what are you doing? I was ready for her. You know, I had all the statistics. Said we spend $15 billion a year at the federal level, tax dollars, $15 billion a year on drug interdiction, on drug eradication in places like Columbia, on enforcement, law enforcement, meaning prosecution, locking people up, and so on. She said, how's that helping me? That has no impact on my life, Congressman. And I had to agree. I was embarrassed. I was like, well, yeah, we're really not, I mean, a lot of supply side stuff, but on the demand side, very, very little. And that's changed somewhat. We started a coalition back home after that that I founded, but has now grown, and it's gotten a couple of national awards. It's a good coalition. It's focused on prevention and education. It's called the Coalition for Drug-Free Greater Cincinnati. I chaired it after that experience for about 9 years, but after a few years, I decided this works, and we did a lot of research, what does work, what doesn't work, and obviously if you can prevent drug abuse in the first place, it's a lot more effective than dealing with addiction. And that's the theory behind these community coalitions. The other theory is that it's not going to happen from the top down. It's going to happen from the bottom up. It's a community effort, and so you engage every segment of the community in it, from law enforcement and the media to businesses and churches and, of course, and synagogues and other religious organizations, and, of course, schools and parents. And parents, by the way, is critical, according to all the research that's been done. Unbelievably, as a parent of still one teenager and two just left teenage years, you wonder, don't you, sometimes? But nothing is more important. So these coalitions work. We did pass this legislation called the Drug-Free Communities Act. There are now over 2,000 community coalitions around the country that have gotten funding through the Drug-Free Communities Coalition that are doing the good work that Marcy does every day in Ohio. And by the way, Ohio has taken full advantage of it. We've got a lot of great coalitions in Ohio. It's an interesting model because it's not a Washington top-down approach. It's to say to a local community, hey, if you want to get together and bring all segments of your community together, and I've been at dozens of them here in Ohio, not just the one in Cincinnati, we'll help you. We'll give you the best research and help you to get started with the best evidence-based approach to these problems, but you got to do it on your own. So it's 100% matching. You got to get $1 of federal money, you got to have a dollar of match at the local level. If you want to get any of the funding at all, you've got to prove that it's working. In other words, you have to have metrics that can actually look at your outcomes. In Cincinnati, we do a drug survey every 2 years. It's almost like a poll. I mean, we talk to 66,000 young people in Cincinnati and get a good sense of it. And you got to do that. You got to test it. If you don't do that, you don't get the money. And so it's a different sort of approach, and I think it's worked really well. And again, Marcy's the expert on how it's working in Ohio today, but I call this constructive conservatism. And I think it's a conservative approach because it's not a Washington top-down approach, and I think it can work in other areas too. We've also, as I'll talk about in a second, tried this successfully, I believe, with Second Chance Act, but there are a few elements to it. One is evidence-based, providing the best research around the country that only the federal government can really provide. I mean, there are groups like Patel that do a great job at that, but that's where someone, the federal government can provide something unique that a local and state government cannot. So it's providing the best evidence and best research, providing the best practices. So looking around the country, figuring what's working, what's not working, and that's exactly what we did with this legislation. So we let people know this coalition's working because they're trying this particular technique to get parents more engaged or to get the media more involved. Leverage, again, using short-term federal dollars. You can only get funding for a short period of time, about 10 years, and you're on your own. And you know, our coalition doesn't get federal funding anymore in Cincinnati, but we've continued to grow because we got in the community support. So it's not telling the taxpayer you're going to pick up the whole tab. It's all matched, but it's also something where there is an ending point to it, and you go to the community for that has therefore more buy-in. And finally, the outcome analysis I talked about. You got to test what you're doing, being sure that you're measuring results and reporting on those results to the stakeholders. So I think that is, again, evidence-based, scientifically sound. It's something that actually works with these community coalitions. One of the issues that we have seen is that while these coalitions started with a focus on prevention and some success, in Cincinnati we can claim a 35% reduction in teenage use of substances, including tobacco, alcohol, and drugs. But where we really have not, in my view, been as successful is in terms of dealing with those who do get addicted. So it's the treatment and recovery, and that is really challenging. But it's incredibly important, and we need to bring some of that same focus from the national level, in my view, onto that issue. I think investing in drug treatment and recovery, in addition to prevention and education, is one of the great new challenges that we have. It's more expensive, and that's one reason you want to avoid getting into that funnel because it is tougher and more expensive, but it is absolutely critical given where we are, particularly with the prescription drug abuse and now heroin abuse, and trying to deal with this issue in terms of this underlying issue of poverty. We've got to figure out a better way to get people off the addiction and into productive lives. Prescription drug abuse, I mentioned, in depressed regions of Ohio was at epidemic levels. It still is in some areas, you could argue. But problem was that you had incredible amounts of opiates, OxyContin and so on, being prescribed to people, and people getting addicted to it. And part of it was the pill mills, which could be shut down, and largely were. Attorney General Mike DeWine's been on top of that. I think he's done a great job there. Law enforcement in general. Part of it is the fact that these drugs come in from other areas, so we got some federal funding through the high-intensity drug trafficking areas, for instance, in southern Ohio, which have worked well. You get the FBI involved, for instance, and the DEA with state and local law enforcement. That all works well. We actually shut down some of the cross-border problem, passed legislation that I authored to deal with that issue. But you know what? All those things that we did helped to get the prescription drug problem under control. But what happened instead? Heroin. So a cheaper form of opiate appears, and today in some of these same communities where we started congratulating ourselves on making so much progress on prescription drug abuse, now you see something in some senses even more insidious, which is less expensive, heroin, less controlled, and you see this incredible problem we have now in Ohio of overdoses. So more people die of overdoses in Ohio than from traffic accidents now. And 3, 4, or 5 people will die today in Ohio from overdoses of opiates. Probably 20,000 overdoses this year, probably 1,000 of those people will die. And you think about that, and wow, if it was anything else, if it was auto accidents or something else, we would probably be paying a lot more attention. So that, I think, is one of the big challenges that we now face, is how do you focus more on the issue of treatment and recovery. There is hope, and there's more focus on it. I'll tell you one place where there is more focus and not only not denial, but embracing it is Ohio State University. There's a recovery group at Ohio State University of students, a young woman named Sarah, who I met recently, who is out there front talking about it. She's in recovery herself. She has started a support group. I think Ohio State's student recovery group is the biggest in the country, and it's one of the few in the country at any college or university. I'm really proud of her. She showed up at a roundtable discussion and held her own and talked about why she's doing this and what it's meant to her. And I think that's really important. We've got to get kind of beyond the stigma and deal with the issue. It's expensive. The success rate is right now very, very low relative to what you would hope that it would be. In April, I went to CompDrug here in Columbus. Some of you know CompDrug. It's a methadone clinic, and they do incredible work on working with people who are addicted to keep them at their jobs, to keep them working, keep them helping their families, again, keep them being productive. And there's some new medications coming out that are actually fairly promising. One is a non-addictive drug called Vivitrol that, as opposed to methadone or Suboxone, actually is a receptor that stops the urge or the craving. It happens to be produced here in Ohio, which I'm excited about, and that's being tried on a pilot basis here in Ohio in about 11 different regions, and that's a potential breakthrough drug in my view. But I think Washington is not very well equipped to deal with it, and I think we've got to figure out a better way, just as we did with the drug prevention side, is how do you, with the kids, how do you deal with treatment? By providing, again, some of the best practices, the science-based approach, ensuring that you have this local buy-in and are helping people to get their community more involved, which is ultimately going to make the bigger difference. I mentioned the issue of recidivism and second chance reentry, and I won't go into great detail, although some of you might have questions about it. But I think the same thing is true there. The Second Chance Act, I was the author of that 10 years ago. It has some of these same elements we talked about with the Drug-Free Communities Act. It's not a big Washington program, but it is helping. It provides about $60 to $80 million a year in grants. They have to be matched. Ohio has been a leading state in terms of using this tool of the Second Chance Act. Some of you in this room have been involved with that. And again, Columbus has taken the lead on that as well. We've got lots of folks in town who've been involved, but Alvis House is one. And I don't know, is Denise here today? Denise Robinson's in the back here. She's got a big award, so I did a little video for her, I know, but very impressed with what they're doing at Alvis House. And it's kind of it's a place where people can come. It's sort of the one-stop center for Second Chance in Ohio. I mention it in part with the drug addiction issue because that's how I got involved with Second Chance, is people started to come to me with these statistics saying, unless you deal with the drug issue, you're never going to get this issue of high recidivism addressed. When you think about it, 95% of the people in prison are going to get out someday. We have record levels of people in prison. Half of those people are back in the system within 2 or 3 years. It's a revolving door. It costs us as taxpayers, $25,000 to $40,000 a year. Isn't there a better way? Certainly there is, and if you don't deal with the drug issue, it's hard to deal with it because they say that 65% of the people in the system have a drug problem. And increasingly, as you know, a lot of people are locked up for drug offenses. Many of them are nonviolent offenders. So dealing with this drug issue is critical to dealing with the Second Chance issue, and that's how I really got plugged into it. Mental health is the other issue, and of course, job training and skills and giving people the opportunity to be able to work. So there are programs that are working. The Second Chance Act, I think, is one of them. I was in Cleveland recently at Lutheran Social Services, met a guy named Melvin. Melvin's my age. Melvin was in and out of the system his whole life. He was a guy that just kept committing crimes. And not only is that a cost to us as taxpayers, but of course it's a cost to the community and to his family. And 4 or 5 years ago, he got out and decided, I'm going to try something different. And he went to this Second Chance Act they have at Lutheran Social Services, and he straightened out his life. And as he says, it's day to day. He's been sober for 4 or 5 years. He now has a job. He loves to cook, and that's one area where there's been a lot of success with Second Chance Act, is to get people into the culinary skills. And he's now a supervisor at a restaurant, and his daughter, who he had never spent any time with, is now living with him, and the first time in his life he has a home. And, he feels great about himself because he's taking care of his family. And he is paying taxes and productive. So it can and does happen. The recidivism rate in Ohio, by the way, has gone down because of the work being done at every level, including by Governor Kasich and the legislature and at the local level, and taking full advantage of the Second Chance Act, to the point that in Ohio, recidivism has fallen 11%. By the way, it's down 15% in Kansas, 18% in Michigan, saving us as taxpayers, all of us, millions of dollars. In Ohio, we think it'll save about $78 million over about a 5 or 6 year period. This is really exciting. And again, Ohio, I'm proud to say, is taking the lead on this. And again, I commend Governor Kasich and his administration and our legislature for being so involved in it. But it's obviously it makes great sense. And if we don't deal with it, again, it is so persistent now in our poorer communities, this notion that ex-offenders coming out, getting into trouble, going back in, and the impact on the family structure and on the economy, that it is an underlying cause of poverty. And so it's one of those issues that has to be dealt with, in my view, if we're going to deal with this issue that we talked about earlier. I have new legislation that puts Second Chance into the federal prison system. I got it through the Judiciary Committee recently. Those of you interested in it, I'd love to follow up, but it's called the Recidivism Reduction in Public Safety Act, and it basically says, before people get out of federal prison, let's actually start this process. The drug treatment, believe it or not, people tend to get drugs in prison, which always has mystified me, but it happens. Mental health, and significantly the job training, the skills training. So when they get out, they're ready. It's not just, here's $5, the shirt on your back, and a bus ticket. It's, here's some skills, some tools, and access to a place like Alvis House where you can get your life back on track and have that second chance and be able to achieve your God-given potential. And that's pretty exciting to me, and I hope we can get that done, because I think it will save a lot of lives. By the way, it also provides for credit, so you can have a reduction in your prison time if you agree to participate in this program. So it is criminal justice reform as well. So people who are in the grip of addiction do need help, and the federal government's not going to solve all their problems, nor should it, but I think the federal government can play a role. some conservatives would say the federal government should just stay out of this area. And sometimes some of this legislation has been somewhat controversial on my side of the aisle because they don't, some of my colleagues don't see where the federal government has a role. And again, I would argue that the federal government does have a role. In fact, it's a unique role that only it can play, but that it's not a role that is traditional, as the War on Poverty programs often are, which is just a Washington program. It's, again, about leveraging, and it's about providing best practices, making sure it's science-based, being sure that you're leveraging at the federal level what works at the local level. When Lyndon Johnson launched the War on Poverty, he said this, and I quote, "For the war on poverty will not be won here in Washington," he said. "It must be won in the field, in every private home, in every public office, from the courthouse to the White House." And I think he was right. And I think Washington has strayed from that approach over the years. So part of this constructive conservatism idea is to get back to what Washington's appropriate role is. And I think it's a major role, but I think it's one that has to be done in partnership. With that, again, thank you for letting me come by today. And Jane, I appreciate it. And I look forward to working with so many here in this room to continue progress on these and other issues that relate to this issue of persistent poverty. I know that it's something worth fighting for. It's about restoring the dreams and hopes of millions of our fellow citizens. And I wish you Godspeed in your good work in addressing some of these same problems. Thank you. All right, Colleen is now going to grill all of us.
I'm going to go ahead and pretend that applause was for me.
Colleen.
Senator, it's interesting to hear you talking about some of these issues, which traditionally, frankly, people don't think of as Republican issues. And I know that you have reached out to Attorney General Eric Holder and asked him to take action. We think of drug problems being a neighborhood issue. It's a local issue. State Attorney General Mike DeWine has become kind of a leader in the heroin fight here. So what is Eric Holder, or what is the federal government not doing at this point that you realistically think that they can be doing?
Yeah, I did write a letter to Eric Holder with a colleague of mine from the other side of the aisle, and it's a bipartisan letter that talks about this holistic approach to opiate addiction, because we do think this is at epidemic levels now, not just in Ohio, but around the country. And some of it is because of the shift from prescription drugs to heroin, which is, you know, sort of a victim of success of prescription drugs, is moving to a cheaper high of heroin. But boy, it's dangerous, and the addiction is so difficult to deal with, and the treatment and recovery is so hard. So we did talk to him about that and the need to do more focus. One specific one that I've encouraged the Department of Justice to look at is they've talked about going into our prison system and taking nonviolent offenders out of the system, having them go back into our communities. And, you know, I understand the need to have some criminal justice reform. I do. I think we have too many people locked up who are nonviolent offenders who should be out. I'm a big fan of drug courts, by the way, and veterans courts, for those of you involved with that here in Columbus. But let's use those as leverage. In other words, one of the ways that we have found success here in Ohio and in this field is to have the threat of incarceration be out there. In other words, to say, if you're willing to get involved in these programs and be tested and reconnect with your family and find a support network outside of it, you know, you will have less prison time. But just to let people out without having that system in place, I think would be a mistake. So I am encouraging them to continue their efforts on criminal justice reform, but tie it into some of these programs that we know work. And I think that would be a much more productive way to deal with the problem, and would help us in terms of this national interest now in second chance and in getting people back into productive lives.
Well, I know you were the original sponsor of Second Chance. Some of the statistics you had today were startling about the poverty levels, especially when we do think of Columbus as being kind of an outlier as far as surviving the recession. It hasn't hit Columbus as hard as it has hit other parts of the state. 50 years ago, Lyndon Johnson talked about, let's have the war on poverty. You sponsored this Second Chance program. What are we not doing? What are we not doing to solve this growing issue in what we think of as being the breadbasket of the world?
When I walked in today, I met one of I think our participants here, I don't know if I don't see him right now. Maybe he was just coming by to give me some advice on the way in. But he said, you know, when you guys started doing welfare reform, it worked well because you had people who were getting back into work and training, and now that's being eroded. And I thought, you know, that's part of the message, I think, is that welfare rolls, you know, were reduced by about 50% in Ohio, and a lot more people went to work, and more people got training and education. I'm not saying it was perfect in every community, but boy, it had a major impact on families, getting them back together and getting people, again, off dependency. So I think part of the challenge is, how do you look at this not as sort of a way to keep people dependent, but keeping the focus on how do you make people independent? And so with Second Chance Act or with the Drug-Free Communities Act, the notion was, you know, Washington's not going to come in and create a new program for dependency, but rather provide some incentive for the local community to be able to match what the federal government's doing, using the leverage of the federal government, using the research, using the best practices and so on, but also with the goal toward having people be independent. And I think that's part of the challenge that we have with the war on poverty, is that so many programs, well-intended, have kept people dependent and not moved toward independence. Another issue that I think is very real, and we didn't talk about today, is the cliff when you get off dependency. So if you're getting a subsidy and support, and you lose that if you choose to go off on your own, and your taxes go up, the penalty can be 50 to 80%. And you've seen some of the analysis of this. Congressional Budget Office just did this in relation to Obamacare, where they said, you know, we're going to lose a lot of jobs. What they were saying is there'll be a few million jobs lost. That's the hourly equivalent of the people who won't work as hard, because if you work to get out of poverty, you end up with this huge penalty. And so this is why I think tax reform has to be part of this, to give people who are moving from poverty to the middle class a little break, and to ensure that these subsidy levels are appropriate so that there is an incentive to get out and to get on your own. I mean, it's kind of a tough love message, and it's not one that everybody wants to talk about, but I think that's part of the problem right now.
I do want to make a quick reminder, if your question was selected, you can make your way to the microphone, because we will be next taking questions from the audience, but I will lose my reporter's badge if I don't also ask you while you're here today. We've been looking at the scandal at the VA. I know you met with veterans this morning. The VA, as far as not only a lack of care, but a cover-up of the delays, and also the situation involving the release of Sergeant Bergdahl in a prisoner exchange. So these are two military-based questions that I think I have to kind of pose to you very quickly. I know that—
Do I have to answer them?
Yeah, yeah, because I know that you have you have some concerns about the Taliban for prisoner exchange, and I'd like to get your quick response to that if I could.
Sure. Well, I was at the VA today, as I said. We also had a town hall meeting with veterans, and bottom line is the VA system is a big, complex system. There are some entities, and I think Chalmers Wiley is one, that are working well. Not perfect, but working pretty well. Their wait list is lower than the national average. Others that are just horrendous, not just because they have an unacceptably high waiting list, you know, the number of people who have to wait for more than a month or so to get even an appointment, but because there was actually fraud on a widespread basis, apparently, where they would hide the fact that they had these waiting lists in order to meet the metrics coming out of the VA in Washington. And it's just unbelievable to me that that could happen, particularly to our veterans who should get the best care and be first in line. But that's what happened. So in Phoenix, you had 1,700 people knocked off the waiting list so that the numbers would look better. And, you know, think about this. Poor guy's waiting at home. How come I keep getting, you know, pushed back? Because I'm not even, and then I'm not even on the waiting list when I go ask. And apparently this happened at a number of places around the country. We don't know how many yet. They're investigating 42 different VA centers. So it's a scandal. I mean, it's a deliberate attempt to, you know, mislead in order to meet their criteria. And those who were harmed by it were a lot of veterans, 40 of whom died in Phoenix while they were on the wait list. So this is horrendous. And I don't think a change at the top is going to be sufficient. I think it's important. I think fresh eyes are needed. And I've talked about Toby Cosgrove recently because he apparently is in the mix. That's just what I hear in the media. That's what you need, is somebody like that from the outside to come in who is good at management, you know, good at, in his case, Cleveland Clinic, not just an efficient delivery, but high quality delivery. And so I think there's a need for that. And I'm supporting legislation that also provides more choice for veterans where they can have a card and go to the private sector in certain instances to create more competition, because I think that's part of the issue. On the Bergdahl release, look, it's gotten to be a very emotional issue and a very partisan issue. My points have been very simple, which is, one, the president ought to follow the law. I mean, it's just outrageous that he didn't, because if he had, I think he would have gotten some good feedback that would have kept us from being in the situation we're in. Because I know what would have happened, having talked to Dianne Feinstein, who's the Democrat chair of the Intelligence Committee, and other Democrats about it. And I know what the Republicans, like Saxby Chambliss, ranking member, would have said, which is, don't do it. You know, these 5 individuals are the kinds of terrorists who, if you let them out, can make a difference in terms of the battlefield in Iraq, in Afghanistan. And you've seen from the Taliban commanders in the field in Afghanistan exactly what their concerns were, because the responses, you saw the Time magazine story probably yesterday, which is they say, you know, this is just great for our morale. These commanders are going to give us, you know, one guy alone the strength of 10,000 men, is what one of these Taliban commanders said. And it's not good policy to avoid the congressional legislation, in my view. There's a separation of powers for a reason. The president ought to follow it, and he could have. But second, I think he would have gotten some good advice, and I don't think it would be a release of these 5 individuals who are now going to be in a position not just to harm all of us who might travel as Americans, but we have troops on the ground still in Afghanistan and will at least for another 2 years. So the battle goes on, and I think that is the biggest concern. So I guess, you know, I hope that this won't happen again, and therefore I'm introducing a resolution, get the Congress on record on a bipartisan basis saying, Mr. President, we actually meant it, because part of the legislation says not just notice. A notice doesn't mean anything to me. It's what you have to do. You have to provide a detailed justification for who you're going to let out and why, and then what their conditions will be upon release. And that just didn't happen here. It still hasn't happened. And I can tell you, I've been in classified briefings that I won't talk about, but I can tell you what didn't happen, which is we don't have a detailed justification as to why you know, these individuals were chosen and what their specific conditions of release are, so that we know they can't get back into the fight.
All right, and we will ask you to introduce yourself and give us your question, please.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, Senator.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for your time and your leadership. My name is Yvonne Honeycutt. I am a member of the Program and Planning Committee here for CMC. And on behalf of our audience, we have maybe 1 or 2 questions for you this afternoon. This one comes from one of our 6 settlement houses here in Franklin County, Godman Gill Association. Do you believe, Senator, the nonprofit sector can be better utilized to support the fixes and solutions? And if so, what are some effective ways for the nonprofit sector to become a little bit more engaged in your work and with your office?
Yeah, thank you, Yvonne. And the answer is emphatically yes. And I mentioned Alvis House earlier and Denise as an example, but I think what's really exciting is what is going on in our communities, particularly at the nonprofit level, and some of the amazing success stories that they've had. And I should let Denise stand up and speak for herself, but part of the success there is a collaboration with all different elements of the community coming together and having a stake in it, you know, feeling like this is something that matters to them. And you know, I just think it's more innovative, and I think the federal government ought to be supporting that. And part of the grant program that we've got with Second Chance does go through these county reentry task forces. And by the way, we have 88 counties in Ohio. There are now, I think, 64 counties that have reentry task forces from about 2 or 3, you know, 5, 6 years ago. So it's exciting what's going on. But ultimately, this money needs to go down into the community and into the actual service providers. And those are the nonprofits who are working in partnership with a lot of government agencies, but who can do a terrific job with sometimes more flexibility and more community input.
Hi.
Senator, I'm Bill Lafayette. I'm chair of the program committee here at CMC. And on behalf of Jennifer Grant, several of our members participated in a poverty simulation on Wednesday morning. What do members of Congress do to really understand the problems of the poor? Do you ever walk in their shoes instead of using reports and studies? My guess is most people in poverty would not believe their congressman could understand their problems.
Yeah, I agree with that, and you're right, and we probably, you know, rely on too many reports. I talked about Melvin earlier, and you know, one reason I enjoy doing these roundtable discussions, not just with the nonprofits and the, you know, the governmental agencies, but also with folks who are being served, is that you do get a little flavor for it that way, and I've enjoyed that. And I did it again today with the veterans for that reason. We had a town hall with veterans rather than just a roundtable with experts, although the experts were there and they provide good input too. But you're right. I mean, you know, it's as I said, some of the statistics are unbelievable. Like, you know, if you just stay in school and you just don't have kids, so you're married, and if you just get a job, you're going to be fine. Doesn't really answer the question, I think. And I'm not suggesting I'm an expert at all. I didn't grow up in poverty. I don't have that personal experience, and I do think we got to figure out a way to get more people, including me, you know, into these communities, understanding what is actually, you know, the issue. And I get back to this. We talked about sex trafficking and child abuse and drug addiction and the whole revolving door on prison and the effect that has on communities and families and the breakup. I mean, I'm not suggesting those are the only issues, but those, from what I've been able to glean, are some of the issues that aren't talked about enough in relationship to poverty. It's not just about money. It's about changing some of the ways in which the federal government helps to deal with these underlying problems.
Senator, we thank you so much for being with us and for coming to Columbus to share this important message.
Thanks, Colin.
Senator Portman.
Thank you.
That was really great.